Welcome to the Love Psychologist podcast, a place where you'll understand your relationship, partner, and yourself on a deeper and more satisfying level. You'll learn to create happy, fulfilling, and lasting relationships. And here's your host, psychologist and award-winning author, Dr. Paulette Sherman.
Hi there, it's Dr. Paulette Sherman, the host of this podcast, The Love Psychologist. Thanks for joining me today. So far in this podcast, we've been doing a series about relationships from the inside out and how your relationship psychology affects your relationships and how your fears and blocks and past baggage, etc., also block your path to love, whether you're dating in a long-term relationship or in marriage. I've long been a therapist and a certified life coach and relationship expert. I work in couples counseling and also with daters, both by phone, Skype, and also in person in my New York office in order to help them find love and improve their long-lasting relationships, both with themselves and others. And so in this series, we've been breaking it down to help you look at your blocks to love and to love more. And in this podcast episode today, we're going to examine your familial blueprint, which sounds like a mouthful. So I don't know if you've heard the term before, but what do I mean by familial blueprint? This is actually a map of what's familiar to you. And by that I mean, what was the way that your parents' dynamic was when you were little, or maybe your step-parents? And even if your parents were divorced, what were the stories that were told about their relationship? And how did you take that on as a map for what you think is normal, even if you're not aware of it, and even if you don't remember it? So there's that part of the familial blueprint, which is how your parents interacted or how men and women interacted in your immediate midst and what you think a relationship is unconsciously. And also there's the very important dynamic of whoever was the opposite sex parent or step-parent in your life. Because oftentimes that's what you've come to know as the opposite sex, and that person, for good or bad, did love you or you loved them, and so that's what's familiar, and often you will repeat that. And the good and the bad characteristics are often similar to what you will choose in a date or a mate, is what I find. So it's just an interesting topic to think about, and as we go, somewhere in this podcast episode, I will give you a series of questions, maybe for homework to just consider or journal about, in terms of your parental dynamic so that you can start to remember it maybe, and also your relationship with your opposite sex parent and how that may affect the types of dates or mates that you choose. So again, the hypothesis is that your first experience of being loved by someone of the opposite sex is what is familiar, and so that might be what you repeat, and also what you found good and bad with your parents' relationship is your roadmap to love, so to speak, and that by making that conscious, you then have a choice to create something different, which many of us, I think, if we thought about it, would want to do, right? Even though we might see that our parents are married 50 years and they're really happy and we want to emulate some of that, maybe just because of our personality or the fact that we're a different generation, we want to do certain things differently. But we really don't have that choice if we just go on automatic patterns and don't make it conscious. So that's what I'm hoping to do a little bit today, and to give you some examples of that. So here's an example. Susan's parent had a dynamic where her mom would boss her dad around, and she was sort of the breadwinner and the one who got all the attention. He was very passive and was the supportive one. And there was some resentment around that. And after Susan got into a long-term relationship with a man, at one point, he lost his job and he began to just kind of do video games and play music, and he was crashing on her couch for rent-free, and she started to get angry about it and to criticize him a lot. And she realized over time, obviously she could break up with him, but she wanted to stay with him, and she realized she was repeating the pattern that she had known on some level, where she was the one who was up there and doing everything, and he was kind of the passive one that would sit around and be the victim. Another example, Miranda's dad had been physically and emotionally unavailable. He had a job where he worked all the time and he traveled, and he would miss her birthdays, and often he loved her, but he didn't know too much about her and would often miss her important needs. And somehow she felt on some level that she might deserve that kind of treatment from a man unconsciously. And so as she got older, she noticed that she would pick these unavailable men. Sometimes they seemed nothing like her dad. They'd be on motorcycles, or they'd be, in a job that they were just really busy, or they'd be long distance, or they for some reason they would love her but wouldn't be able to commit. So that same feeling unconsciously felt very familiar to her. And even though she wouldn't have said she wanted to repeat that, somehow she felt that that's what, even though the packages looked different, that's what the pattern she kept replaying. And she would try to convince them that, that they did love her and that she could master a different ending. In another situation, Tanya's father had been pretty wealthy, but he was always feeling like a person, almost like a kid from the Depression, that even though he made like $400,000, that the business was going to go under. And so he would go to thrift shops to buy his shirts. He would never let her spend any money. They would cut coupons, even though really she couldn't understand because they had all this money. And so it was very difficult for her because she had to develop this fearful relationship with money. And she said she never really wanted that. She didn't want to ask her husband permission for money or anything like that. But she noticed that is something that she began to feel in her own life, and then eventually would replay sometimes with her dates as well. And that was something she wanted to change. In some ways, it's easier for folks who experience these things with their childhood in order to deal with them in another person because it was familiar. They already had to cope with it. So again, it's what feels normal to them, even if on some conscious level they don't want that. They can kind of deal with those people better than somebody who would never tolerate it or was very unfamiliar to them. So that's kind of irony. But again, we don't want to just be prey to our unconscious blueprints because they're familiar. We want to raise our consciousness about them so that we can identify the opposite traits we want early on and begin to choose with more consciousness and have a different ending. So, for example, if Tanya wanted to heal her money issues and she wanted to look for somebody who had a really good relationship with money psychologically, who saw themselves as an abundant manifester, who was generous, and who wanted to encourage her to experience all the joys that she could with the energy of money, let's say, she had to probably work on her own psychology around money and improve it and feel like she's a good manifester, so she didn't have to rely on somebody to make all those decisions or to control her. And she had to kind of notice when she was dating that she wasn't just picking the same kind of things she was familiar with, and to talk to the person about it and to notice their actions and things like that, which can take some time. But then she was able to shift it both inside and outside. In the case of Miranda, whose dad had been physically and emotionally unavailable, she needed to map out what being physically and emotionally available actually looked like, because she didn't even know, she knew what she didn't want, but she didn't really know what she did want. So she had to decide I want someone who's going to call me regularly, who will live pretty close by, who will actually be interested in what I'm doing on a daily basis and support me and show up, who is okay with committing, who's really attuned to my feelings and needs, who's a good communicator, and what are some ways she would see that when she was dating or in a relationship. And once she kind of mapped it out, it became much more clear, and she got out of her own unconscious way. She could just see right in front of her who was doing that and who wasn't. But it's interesting because a lot of times before, when somebody had been physically or emotionally available, she would put them in the friend zone or wouldn't be attracted to them, even though she knew that was good for her because it wasn't a match to what she was used to inside. So she had to kind of make room for a new blueprint and then start to act on that, which again is not always easy to do. It might take some time and you might need to practice it. But the first part is awareness. Now, in the case of a marriage, because I just gave some examples from dating, you might think, what good is this? I'm already stuck with the person. I already made a choice. Maybe it was unconscious, and I picked someone similar to my dad or my mom. So now what do I do? But the funny thing is that, again, coming back to the fact that you can only control yourself, in family therapy, they often say that when one person in a family changes, the whole structure changes, right? It's just like they say when a butterfly changes their wing pattern or something, it's affected all across the country. So whether it's physics or not, changing the dynamic can happen just from one person. So we'll use the example of that bossy woman, the bossy mom, and the passive dad. And the fact that, maybe he's going to stay passive. Maybe he's comfortable with that. Maybe he even unconsciously likes the fact that she's bossy and makes the decisions. But if she realizes that she doesn't want to be that way anymore, she can begin to shift it. And so even though her first instinct might be to tell him what to do because she has no patience and can't wait for him to decide something, she can begin to put a pause there and to speak to him with more respect and less arrogance and not to push him into things. And once she realizes that this is the pattern she falls into, she can make an alternative response that can create a healthier new pattern with him with more options. And, maybe give him 3 choices or wait longer for him to think about it and process and decide, or ask him to choose. And that totally shifts the dynamic of their marriage just by how she's being. So I'm going to take a moment to pause and to give you some things to think about now. So maybe you want to take out a piece of paper or something, or just jot it down in your phone, or you could come back to this point in the recording. But it might be good for you to just journal and think about your own situation, first with your relationship with your opposite sex parent. So in this case, I'm going to talk about it with your father, but it could be your mother. And I want you to ask yourself, what was good in your relationship with him during your childhood? What was challenging? What did you need that you maybe never got? What do you still hold against your dad or your mom in this case? Do you accept them for who they are and for who they're not? Can you appreciate what you did get? And are you willing to do that now? How could you emotionally shift this so that it would serve you in your relationships? These are just some questions that just get you started to think about it, and you can add any other ones. And then when you have time, you can think about your parental dynamic and what was good in their relationship. What would you want to emulate? What was destructive and what would you want to change? What roles did they have with each other? How do you express those characteristics and that dynamic in your relationships now and in the past? And what might you like to do differently? And how might you begin to accomplish that? Also, what tends to get in your way the most? And how can you begin to get over that? If you have any questions regarding this or any aha moments, I would love to hear about it. So I have a contact form on my main website, which is drpaulettesherman.com. drpaulettesherman.com. And there's a contact page, and you can just write me whatever the aha moment is or the issue, and how you realize that you've been replaying maybe certain characteristics that were troubling that your opposite sex parent had, or certain dynamics in your marriage, or your, with dating, or in your long-term relationships. And if you're stuck in how to shift it, I don't know if I'll have the answer, but I'm willing to come up with some suggestions if I have any. And if you give permission, it might be helpful to other people listening on a future podcast episode, not to say your name, but just to bring up that issue. Because again, a lot of us repeat the same things, and we're more alike than we know as human beings. So I hope that this makes sense and that this has been thought-provoking for you. And again, I hope to hear from you and to make this podcast series more customized so it's really meaningful to you in a personal way. I think it's important that we remember that our past can become our present very easily in our future when we don't learn from it and try to master it. And so I'm hoping that this will provide an opportunity to do so. I wish you my very best in love, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
You've been listening to tips on how to create great relationships from the inside out with host Dr. Paulette Sherman. If you've liked what you've heard, please subscribe for future episodes here and rate this podcast. You can find more information at Paulette's website, drpaulettesherman.com.